The noise regulations require duty holders to manage the risk associated with noise at their workplace. Basically, this means that you can't expose workers to noise above the exposure standard, and those exposure standards are consistent with our current legislation in terms of 85 dBA over an 8-hour period and the 140 dB over the peak. In addition, the legislation requires a worker who is frequently required to wear personal protective equipment to protect against noise that exceeds the exposure standard to be provided with audiometric testing. So to clarify, if your control measure in your workplace is to provide workers with personal protective equipment, because without it they would be exposed to noise levels above that exposure standard, you would be required to provide audiometric testing for those workers. The audiometric testing requirements basically say that the audiometric testing must be done within 3 months of commencing work as the baseline, and then within at least every 2 years after that. In terms of hazardous manual task, the regulation requires the duty holder to manage the risk of a musculoskeletal disorder associated with a hazardous manual task. This is nothing new for Queensland. We've always had our code of practice for manual tasks, and that covers managing the risks associated with hazardous manual tasks in your work environment. This legislation does go a little bit further in determining the factors that a duty holder must take into account before determining what control measures are to be taken into place. It requires a duty holder to consider such things as postures, movement, forces, vibration, and the duration and frequency of that hazardous manual task before deciding to put in control measures. The provisions themselves also cover the upstream duty holders, so the designers, importers, suppliers and manufacturers, and their duty is to eliminate or minimise hazardous manual tasks so far as reasonably practicable in relation to the plant or structure that they're providing in that workplace. This legislation on hazardous manual tasks will be supported by a national code of practice. The confined spaces regulation is fairly consistent with our existing regulation. There is a change to the definition of a confined space. The definition removes the fact that a confined space can have a restricted means of entry or exit, and that aligns it with the 2009 Australian Standard for Confined Spaces. In addition, the regulation doesn't reference certain clauses of the Australian standard like our current regulation, and this makes the document a lot more usable because you can go to that whole section and look at all the requirements required for a confined space without having to purchase the Australian standard. There is a general duty on the person conducting a business or undertaking to control the risks associated with a confined space, and it also covers off more specific duties such as having confined space entry permits, emergency procedures and a communication system. In addition, this is one of the regulations in the model regulations that requires a risk assessment to be done and requires that risk assessment to be documented. The section also covers more of those upstream duty holders, so the designers, manufacturers, importers and suppliers, and their duty is limited to ensuring that as far as reasonably practicable that confined spaces are eliminated or entry into a confined space is eliminated, and if that's not possible that entry is minimised so far as reasonably practicable. The new regulation also covers falls. The key difference for Queensland is that this regulation won't apply just to the construction industry. It will apply across all workplaces and all industries throughout the state. The duty itself is for the person conducting a business or undertaking to manage the risk of a fall of a person from one level to another. So if I was falling on this floor here, that wouldn't be considered to be a fall because it's not from one level to another. So if I was changing the light above me and I was using a stepladder and I fell, that would consider to be a fall under this legislation. In addition, that fall has to be likely to cause injury to me. The legislation does go a little bit further with some specific requirements about falls, and first of all it requires elimination. So it requires the duty holder to get their work done on the ground or to get that work done on a solid construction. And by a solid construction I mean a place that is covered, that has perimeter boundaries that no one can fall off, that the structure itself can support the persons or things that are put on them, and there's no holes that people can fall through. So if you were in a building that was on the 5th floor that was being constructed and it didn't have perimeter guard railing, that wouldn't consider to be a solid construction. If it's not reasonably practicable to eliminate the risk of a fall through working on the ground on a solid construction, the legislation provides that the PCBU or the duty holder must provide adequate protection against the risk. The adequate protection includes providing administrative control, so having a safe system of work, and one of the following. So providing a fall prevention advice, so that might be things such as perimeter guardrails to actually physically prevent that person from falling off, or providing a work positioning system, so some sort of lanyard or travel restraint system where a person can't go to the edge where they can fall off. And if it's not reasonably practical to do that, to provide a fall protection system, a fall arrest system, so things such as a fall arrest harness. If the duty holder does implement the fall arrest harness system, they do need to have systems in place for emergency rescue, and there is no ability for self-rescue under the new legislation. The other interesting thing about this regulation is the falls regulation doesn't use the 2 metre or 3 metre rule that we have in our current construction regulations. So regardless of the height, the PCBU or the duty holder must manage the risk with that fall. So essentially it could mean that inspectors can issue notices for falls that might be under 2 metres, that might be at 1 metre, that might be at 1.5 metres, and that is a significant change for Queensland. I think the key point here is if there is a risk of a fall in your workplace and it is likely to cause injury to a person, that fall risk needs to be controlled, and you need to do that through elimination and if not through minimisation. In terms of high-risk work licences, you will continue to have a high-risk work licence to perform high-risk work occupations. So the scaffolders, the doggers, the riggers, the tower crane operators, the mobile crane operators, you will need to have your high-risk work licence in place. That licence will still be the 5-year photographic licence that you can get through Australia Post outlets. In addition, there will be a new part of the legislation that allows the regulator to direct a licence holder to have their competency reassessed. And this is where we might observe, for example, a forklift operator driving a forklift inappropriately or not competently or not in a safe way. This time we can direct an operator to have their competency reassessed without suspending or cancelling their licence, and it allows them to continue to operate while their competency is being reassessed. In terms of the schedule of high-risk work, there is a new high-risk work for reach stacker, which is a piece of equipment which is used out at the ports to move containers, and then the boiler operation classes are being condensed from basic, intermediate and advanced through to standard and advanced. One key question I get asked at this time in the presentation is what is happening with earth moving and particular crane certificates next year. As from next year, you will no longer require a licence from us to operate earth moving or particular cranes. What it does mean for duty holders is that you will need to ensure that people operating that equipment are competent and safe to do so. There still will be national courses available for people to undertake through RTOs or through the vet sector to get training on how to operate earth moving equipment. And that is a positive thing, because you can be assured that when workers come to you with a certificate of completion from an RTO, that they have been trained in the use of that equipment. You will have to take that a step further and test their competency just to make sure that they are competent to do that work into the future. The demolition work regulations covers everything from the notification of demolition work through to demolition licensing. Demolition work itself is defined as work to demolish or dismantle a structure that is load-bearing, but does not include the removal of formwork or false work or light or power poles. There are also notification requirements. So if you're demolishing a structure or part of a structure that is load-bearing, that is at least 6 metres in height, or if you're demolishing using load shifting equipment on a suspended floor, or if you're demolishing using explosives, you need to notify the regulator before that work commences. In addition, the demolition licensing requirements that we currently have will transition over into the new scheme, and the reason for that is the National Occupational Licensing System will be addressing demolition licensing in 2013. In terms of electrical safety, the first point I'd like to make is that the electrical safety regulations will be incorporated into the Electrical Safety Regulation 2002. The legislation itself requires a duty holder to manage the risks associated with electrical risks at that workplace. Testing and tagging requirements will change slightly. Instead of being linked to the Australian Standard 3760, Testing and tagging requirements are required where the electrical equipment is in operating conditions that are likely to result in the equipment having a reduced lifespan. So where you're moving that piece of equipment around frequently, or where that equipment might be exposed to chemicals, moisture, heat, something that can reduce its lifespan, does mean that you will need to test and tag that piece of equipment. This may impact on the office environment, so for a photocopier that is not moved, may not necessarily have to have testing and tagging in place in that office environment. It's not a hostile operating environment. In terms of the regularity of testing and tagging requirements, there is no link to Australian Standard 3760, and the legislation provides that testing and tagging intervals are undertaken regularly. The testing and tagging requirements, the details of those will be in the Code of Practice, and it will provide examples of timeframes of what is considered regular for testing and tagging requirements. The legislation also provides a prohibition on live work, which is consistent with our current requirements. There also covers the work on de-energised electrical equipment, and those provisions really cover about making sure that the equipment can't become re-energised during that work that's being undertaken. The regulations also cover the use of residual current devices, or as they are commonly known, RCDs. Again, RCDs are required for hostile operating environments, and this may mean that in some non-hostile operating environments, such as the office workplace, that may not be a requirement. The change for Queensland is that residual current devices can be portable or installed. At the moment, the legislation really requires residual current devices to be fixed, with some exemptions in the rural industry and the manufacturing industry. Again, the testing of residual current devices is not linked to Australian Standard 1360, but is related to testing regularly by a competent person. And again, the Code of Practice that supports these provisions will provide details of that. Diving work is also covered by the Work Health and Safety Regulations. At this point, it's just critical for me to remind the audience that we also have a Safety and Recreational Water Activities Act 2011. That Act really covers the participants that are taking part in underwater or water activities. This legislation really covers the occupational diving side of things. So a person who is employed as a resort diver will need to comply with these provisions, because resort diving work is occupational diving. In terms of the regulation itself, it's broken into three divisions: a general diving work, the managing risks, which covers everything from your dive safety log through to your high risk diving work. In terms of the general diving work, there's two elements. It talks about fitness of the person doing that work and also the competence of the worker. So any worker that's doing diving work must have a certificate of medical fitness, and that's issued by a doctor who's trained in occupational dive medicine. And then the person must be competent, so they must be trained by an RTO, and that competency needs to be related to the type of work that they're doing. So you couldn't be sending someone along to do seafood harvesting with a resort diving qualification. It needs to be relevant to the work that's being undertaken. In terms of high-risk diving work, that basically includes construction work, and those competencies, the fitness of the workers doing that work, must be carried out and meet the Australian Standard 2299. The next chapter covers plant and structures. This chapter is very different to what we currently have in Queensland, as our plant regulations are really limited to registrable plant and registrable plant design. These provisions are a lot more extensive and comprehensive. There is an exclusion in this provision. It doesn't apply to plant that is held by hand and operated by hand. So things such as screwdrivers, spanners, saws are not covered by the general plant regulations. The outline of the regulation itself, there's some general duties for those upstream duty holders, so the designer, manufacturers and porters, and also the persons conducting a business or undertaking that might have some control over plant in their workplace. It then goes on to some additional requirements for registrable plant, and then finally covers off the registrable plant and registrable plant design. I won't go into the specifics of the requirements on those upstream duty holders, but it does cover everything from guarding through to emergency controls, and also making sure that people can't inadvertently operate equipment. In terms of the person conducting the business or undertaking with management of control of plant, they must manage the risks associated with that. And that covers everything from making sure that plant is stored safely, that plant can't be inadvertently operated, hot plant is protected to make sure that it can't burn people. So there's a number of specific requirements for people with management or control of plant. The important one and the different one for Queensland is there is a requirement on persons with management or control of plant to maintain, repair, inspect and test their equipment by a competent person. A competent person is someone who's got skills, training and knowledge in that particular piece of equipment. If it's not reasonably practicable to do your testing and inspection according to the manufacturer's inspections, that should be what you do in the first point of call. Otherwise, it should be by recommendations from a competent person. If that's not reasonably practicable, the inspection and testing of that equipment should be done at least on an annual basis. There are additional control measures for certain plant, and some of these are really obvious. So for tractors, they must have ROPS or rollover protective structures. For earth-moving equipment, they must have FOPS, which is the falling objects protective structure. The legislation then dives a little bit deeper. It talks about additional control measures for registered plant, and that includes the requirements such as for the tower cranes, the 10-year major inspection, which is consistent with the current requirements in Queensland. In addition, for registrable plant, there are record-keeping requirements in terms of your maintenance, inspection, testing and repair. In terms of the registrable plant and plant design, they are consistent with our current requirements. There are two minor differences. Cooling towers and air conditioning units will no longer be registrable from the 1st of January 2012. In addition, there is something new to be brought into the fold. Large inflatable devices will require registration as an amusement device moving forward from the 1st of January next year. In addition, we've moved the registration cycle for registrable plant from annual registration to a 5-year duration, and we believe that will reduce some of the administrative burden in Queensland in terms of having to register equipment every year and now moving to a 5-year cycle. Construction work regulations are very consistent with what we currently have in Queensland. The definition of construction work is almost the same except for the inclusion of maintenance. So where you are maintaining a structure, that is considered to be construction work. There are a number of exceptions to that about what is not construction work. For example, if you're manufacturing plant, that is not considered to be construction work. Or if you're developing or constructing prefabbed elements for construction work, so precast tilt-up panels that are manufactured off-site and brought to the construction site, that work is not considered to be construction work. In addition, it also says that testing, maintenance or repair work of a minor nature that is carried out in connection with the structure is not considered construction work. The definition of minor work is not described or defined in the legislation. If it was minor work, if you're working in a high-risk work environment, there were multiple businesses or undertakings in that work environment, the work was going over an extensive period, that probably wouldn't be minor work in the construction context. Except the contrasting example is if you got someone in to hang a door, that wouldn't be considered to be construction work, and that would be work of a minor nature. In addition, construction work doesn't include mining or the exploration or extraction of minerals. In addition, the construction work does not apply to plant generally, except there are some exceptions. If the plant is a ship or a submarine, or there's a pipeline or an underground tank, the construction regulations will apply. In addition, work on plant that relates to the work that is carried out in connection to the construction work. So, for example, if I'm erecting a tower crane and it's in the tower crane yard, the operator's yard, and we're doing that for maintenance, that's not considered construction work. But if I'm erecting a tower crane on a construction site and it's related to that construction work, that is considered to be construction work, and the construction regulations apply. In addition, the construction regulations will apply to work on fixed plant where it's overhaul or outage work, and that work involves 5 or more persons conducting a business or undertaking at one time. The reason for that is that we really want the construction regulations to apply to that work that is very high risk. You've got a number of workers and businesses working over the top of each other, and there is a need for a principal contractor there to coordinate that work on that site. Obviously, if you are doing work on plant that is overhaul or outage work and you're the only person conducting a business or undertaking doing that work, the construction regulations wouldn't apply. In terms of the construction work and who is the principal contractor, the principal contractor is the person who commissions the work, so the client, and they are the PCBU, or they are the principal contractor, I should say, unless they have engaged someone else as a principal contractor and giving them management or control of that site. In terms of the threshold for appointment of a PC, it has moved up to $250,000, so we currently have an $80,000 threshold. We're moving to this $250,000 threshold instead. So if your construction work or your construction project is valued at $250,000 or more, the construction regs will apply and you will need to appoint a principal contractor. The Code of Practice itself provides details on how to calculate, how that figure is actually calculated and what needs to be taken into account to come to that figure. The other change for Queensland is that there is only one principal contractor per construction site. So regardless of the number of the work going on, there should only be one PC for that whole construction project itself. In addition, there's no requirement for businesses to notify us of who is the principal contractor into the future. And the reason for that is that it's an administrative burden, and the new regulations require principal contractors to erect signs at the front gate of their construction projects identifying who the principal contractor is and their contact details. Some further details about construction work. So the person who commissions the work, the client, must provide information and must consult with the designer about the structure to ensure risks can be managed at that design stage. In addition, the designer of the structure is required to give the client a report on the peculiarity of the design of that structure. So if it's a structure that's common and it's used all the time, there'll be no need for that. But if there's some peculiarity associated with that structure, the designer needs to provide that report to that client. The client must also give information to the principal contractor that they have and that they know about the hazards and risks associated with that workplace. So for example, the construction project might have contaminated soil, and it would be appropriate there for the client to advise the principal contractor of that particular hazard at that particular site. The person who's conducting the business or undertaking who's doing the construction work has a general duty to manage the risk associated with that work, and manage the risk links back to the earlier chapters of the regulation going through the hierarchy of control. So all foreseeable risks must be managed on that site. In addition, the legislation requires a person conducting a business or undertaking who has management or control of that workplace to ensure that that workplace is secured from unauthorised access. And a good example of this is that if you're building a house that might be in the middle of outback Queensland, there's not a lot of chance or likelihood that people will come by that site. It might be appropriate for you to put perimeter fencing around, different to a house that might be being built right beside a school or a shopping centre, where the person conducting a business or undertaking would know that it's likely that children could enter that site when they finish school and get injured. So in that case, we'd be expecting a higher level of security at that site to prevent unauthorised access, and that might be through perimeter fencing, or it might be through having a security guard at that site to ensure that people don't access it. It could also be if there's a pool there, particularly fencing that pool to make sure there's no unauthorised entry to that place. The requirements for safe work method statements does stand and is consistent with the current requirements in Queensland. So if you are doing high risk construction work, and I should say at this point in time we do get asked, has the definition of high risk construction work changed? It has slightly, only in the respect of that the principal contractor cannot deem any other work as high risk, but otherwise all the categories of high risk work are remaining the same. The requirements for a safe work method statement are consistent with what we currently have in Queensland, and the details of those will be supported in the Managing Risk for Construction Work Code of Practice. The requirements in terms of safe work method statement means that if you are doing high risk work, a duty holder is required to develop a safe work method statement, and that work needs to be carried out in accordance with that safe work method statement. If that work is not carried out in accordance with the statement, that work must be stopped immediately and cannot be resumed until that work is undertaken in accordance with that statement. The example of the situation of safe work method statements for construction workplace is an interesting one. The legislation under the Act, Section 46, says that Duty holders who have the duty for the same matter must consult, cooperate and coordinate with each other. On a construction site, ideally it would be good to have one safe work method statement for that particular high-risk work, rather than each person conducting a business or undertaking who's doing that work to have their own. This makes sense because there'd be no inconsistencies and everyone would be on the same page in terms of the requirements for that high-risk work. Apart from that, safe work method statements must be given to the principal contractor prior to that work commencing, and they must be kept in a way that's readily available. So if you're on a construction site, they should be kept in the construction office. If it's more of a landscaping or an earth moving type job, they might be kept in the glove box of the car where they can be readily accessible at that time. There are additional requirements for excavation work in terms of the construction regulations. These are very similar to what we have for Queensland, so it is the dial before you dig stuff, and it is using that information to make sure that the excavation work that you're undertaking takes into account where the underground services lie in relation to that work. There's also requirements for trenching, so where you're doing an excavation and that excavation is at least 1.5 metres deep, that you need to put in control measures such as benching, battering or shoring. If you don't do those, you do need a report from a geotechnical engineer letting you know that that particular trench is safe to enter and not at risk of collapse. There are certain duties on the principal contractor as well. Earlier I mentioned they have to put signage at the front gate of their construction workplace which identifies them and their contact details during business hours and also after hours. The principal contractor is also required to prepare a work health and safety management plan, and this is very consistent with our construction safety plan. The plan itself must include site rules, and the principal contractor has a duty to inform all persons of the plan before they commence that construction work that's related to that particular job. The principal contractor also needs to make sure that that plan remains up to date with any changes that might occur in the construction workplace. They've also got a requirement to obtain safe work method statements for high-risk construction work before that work commences. In addition, some of the earlier chapters in the regulations such as first aid, emergency procedures, facilities also apply to the principal contractor. It doesn't mean the principal contractor has to provide this, but they have to ensure that those facilities are at that workplace. And again, this highlights the need for duty holders who share that same duty to consult, cooperate and coordinate on things such as workplace facilities, first aid and emergency planning. In addition, there are some general housekeeping requirements for principal contractors, so they need to ensure all the construction waste is actually removed at regular intervals to make sure that there's no risk associated with that being on site, and they also need to manage the traffic management and the essential services on site. There is no requirement for site-specific induction under the new construction regulations, and you might recall from the earlier discussion there that a principal contractor has to develop a work health and safety management plan, and that includes site rules, and they have to take all people who are doing construction work through that plan. So arguably that mops up the site-specific induction. There is still a requirement for general construction induction, and that's the white card or the previous blue card that people hold for to perform construction work. The requirement has changed a little bit, that card will remain valid while that person is doing construction work, but if that person leaves the construction industry for a consecutive period of 2 years, they would have to redo that general construction induction training course. So it is up to the person conducting the business or undertaking and the principal contractor to ask that question when workers are coming on site. Do you have your card? Have you performed construction work in the last 2 years? If the answer to that is no, that person will need to go back and redo their construction induction again. In terms of flammables and combustibles moving forward, the licences that are currently issued by local governments for flammables and combustible liquids will be abolished from the 1st of January 2012. Workplace Health and Safety Queensland will take over that role in terms of regulating flammables and combustible liquids under the new hazardous chemicals regulation. The hazardous chemicals regulation also prohibits a person below the age of 16 from supplying a flammable gas or flammable liquid. So for example, a person could still be working in a retail store and selling those products, but they couldn't be decanting those products from one container to another or refuelling a car. The lead regulations are very consistent with what we currently have in Queensland, except there is no requirement for a written risk assessment to be undertaken, and that's consistent with the earlier parts of the model regulations. The level that you have to start monitoring for blood in the system has been halved, and we believe that will actually increase safety in that particular area because your monitoring is starting at that lower level. There's also no requirement for a worker who is pregnant or breastfeeding to notify their employer of that, but because of the lowering of the levels for monitoring, that person will be seeing a doctor during that process, and that particular risk associated with being pregnant and working around lead can be managed through that particular process. In addition, it is a requirement for the duty holder to provide information to workers before they start work about the risks associated with working in a lead risk environment. The asbestos regulations are a lot more comprehensive than what we currently have in Queensland, and this is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the details of the 80 pages of regulation on this particular matter. Essentially, the person with management or control of a workplace, so the owner, for example, of a building, must ensure that all asbestos is identified by a competent person. Following on from that, the presence and location of asbestos should be identified by a label where that's reasonably practicable. Where a person can't access an area and they believe it is to be asbestos, it really should be presumed that there is asbestos in that workplace. The requirements for a register still exist, except the cutoff for having a register has actually been changed. So at the moment you only need a register for a building in Queensland that was built before the 1st of January 1990. The new model regulations moves this to the 31st of December 2003. So it will be a requirement on a number of duty holders to go out and create a register that they currently haven't had to do, and possibly that register will say that there's just no asbestos present. But regardless, that register needs to be done, and it is an important document for contractors that are coming into your site to know whether there is asbestos and whether they're going to disturb that asbestos during their work. In terms of the asbestos management plans, those requirements are the same, but there is an additional requirement for naturally occurring asbestos, and you must have requirements in place to manage that where that might happen. So people working in civil construction, they might be digging roads, that might come across naturally occurring asbestos, need to make sure they manage that risk and train their workers in how to deal with that. In addition, there's always been health monitoring requirements for asbestos, but these new model regulations require health monitoring for persons other than removal workers. So electricians and plumbers that might be renovating bathrooms, or electricians that might be drilling through walls to put cables through that might be exposed to asbestos, but they're not an asbestos removal worker, will need to have health monitoring undertaken for them as well. There's also a requirement to notify the regulator of a licensed asbestos removal work, so this notification requirement is new. There's also, the notification requirements also cover demolition of a workplace or a structure that is built before the 31st of December 2003, or where asbestos fibres in the air are exceeding the exposure standard, and that's as a result of removal of friable asbestos. There is also a new licence category for asbestos, so this person is called an asbestos assessor, and they'll be required for Class A or friable asbestos removal work, and they'll have a role in doing clearance air monitoring, clearance inspections, and issuing a clearance certificate once that work has been undertaken. In addition, there is a requirement for an independent competent person to do the same work but for Class B or bonded asbestos removal work. So for friable asbestos, you'll need an asbestos assessor. For bonded removal work, you'll need a competent person to issue you with that clearance certificate. Under the new legislation, both our Class A, our friable asbestos removal work licence, and our Class B licence will be held by a person conducting a business or undertaking. This is a change for those Class B licence holders because they've been given to natural persons. So, for example, Joe Bloggs would hold a Class B licence. Moving forward next year, it'll be Joe Bloggs' business or company that would need to hold that licence. And transitional arrangements have been put in place to transitional those B-class licence holders over for a year to allow them to transition to the new licensing requirements. In terms of the demolition and refurbishment requirements, where you are demolishing or refurbishing a structure that was built before the 31st of December 2003, you must remove that asbestos as far as reasonably practicable for demolition, and the same for refurbishment, that you must either try and remove it or not disturb it during that work. There's also a requirement there for demolishing structures where there's an emergency, and then you need to notify the regulator of that, and ultimately that asbestos still needs to be removed as far as reasonably practicable. The Major Hazard Facilities regulations were previously located in Queensland's Dangerous Goods Safety Management Act 2001. These provisions have now been moved across to the Work Health and Safety regulations and have really been matched and mirrored on the existing national standard for major hazard facilities, and those requirements are all very consistent with what the current requirements in Queensland are. One of the final chapters in the regulation is the general chapter, and that chapter covers everything from reviewable decisions through to exemptions and some notification requirements. There are 65 reviewable decisions under the legislation, and the first point of call is internal review by the regulator, by a person who is more senior than the person who made that decision. Ultimately, if a person isn't happy with that decision, they can seek an external review, and the external review body in Queensland is the Queensland Civil Administrative Tribunal. In terms of exemptions, there is the ability for exemptions, but these will be based on national decision making, and it won't be a matter of just trying to convince Workplace Health and Safety Queensland. It'll be a matter of trying to convince all the national players that this exemption is required. Finally, the regulation here covers incident notification requirements, but specifically for prescribed serious illnesses. The notification requirements are really covered by the Work Health and Safety Act. The regulation really just provides the details. In terms of serious illnesses, any infection which relates to carrying out of work where work was a significant contributing factor needs to be notified to Workplace Health and Safety Queensland, and that's a general catch-all. And then finally, it covers off the occupational zoonoses, so your Q fever, your Hendra virus, your avian influenza, they also need to be notified to Workplace Health and Safety Queensland. If you would like further information, you can jump onto our website at www.worksafe.qld.gov.au, or you can call our info line on 1300 369 915.